Now from the 6th hour there was darkness all over the land until the 9th hour. And about the 9th hour Jesus cried out with a loud voice, saying, Eli, Eli, lema sabachthani. In English, my God, why have you forsaken me? And of course, the author of Matthew borrowed this from Mark. However, the phrase actually comes from Psalm 22, 1 and 2. My God, why have you forsaken me? Why are you so far from saving me? So far from my cries of anguish. My God, I cry out by day, but you do not answer, and by night, but I find no rest. This is a Psalm of Lament, a prayer by a person who does not feel the presence of God in the midst of suffering, but is experiencing fear in the face of persecution by his enemies. These same words were put on the lips of Jesus in the Passion narrative. However, Psalm 22 is not a prophecy with David pointing to Jesus. It is a lament begging God to make himself present in the midst of pain. Jesus did experience a similar situation when he was attacked by those who hated him. And so the gospel writers used the psalm to articulate his feelings and the events surrounding the crucifixion. It is just more Old Testament midrash, in use, by the way. The psalm begins by asking God why he's been absent. This is even though Israel praises him, and they remind him he rescued their ancestors in the past. But now, since their God is now absent, the psalmist's enemies have demeaned him. He feels subhuman. And even though he has had a relationship with God since birth, he then complains about the harmful actions of his enemies, referring to them using animal analogies like bulls, lions, dogs, and notes his fearful response. He makes one final appeal for help. So before concluding his prayer, he adds another praise. There is no doubt of disappointment with his God by bringing it up. In the Old Testament context, the question why was uttered when they felt abandoned by God in the midst of their pain. The lesson here is if we are angry or disappointed with God, we should tell him. Well, Jesus did. Such prayers from the Old Testament have come to be called laments, which are seen as expressions of grief, sorrow, regret, and disappointment. To lament means to wail, moan, cry, or sob. To offer a complaint, a statement that a situation is unsatisfactory or unacceptable, often expressed in anger or confusion. Here's an example of another lament from the Old Testament prophet Habakkuk. How long, O Lord, must I call for help, but you do not listen? Or cry out to you violence, but you do not save? Why do you make me look at injustice? Why do you tolerate wrongdoing? Destruction and violence are before me. There is strife, and conflict abounds. Therefore the law is paralyzed, and justice never prevails. The wicked hem in the righteous, so that justice is perverted. Out of 150 psalms, 48 are individual laments, and 16 are corporate laments, for a total of 64. There are 15 psalms of trust, 20 of praise, and 13 of wisdom. Remember, the book of Psalms was the hymn book for ancient Israel. 43% of their songs have proved to be complaints and expressions of sadness, as well as disappointment with God. All these laments were obviously meant as anger towards their God. They were expressing disappointment in him for failing them in one way or another. And this may not sit right with you, but if Jesus actually said these words, well, he was disappointed too. Disappointed in the conditions of humanity and the God of this world. But obviously he was strong-willed and up to the task. You know, he possessed powers as expressed in the gospel stories that proves he could have saved himself. But his mission on earth was to sacrifice himself to save mankind. And that is most likely why the story has stayed around for so long. Just think about it. The God of the universe sent a human to live among us and to sacrifice himself for our sake. There's the reason it's called the greatest story ever told. Christians and the Abrahamic religions view God, otherwise known as Yahweh or Allah, as a benevolent and righteous being. The Gnostics viewed him as evil and say Jesus had to overcome him to save us. Jesus lived a spotless life so that he was worthy of the sacrifice. His ransom paid for our release from fear of sin and the law of Yahweh. Now that's an act of love, and it proves our Lord is only love.